February 17th, 1979. 4:47 a.m. Soviet Military Intelligence Headquarters, Moscow. Colonel General Pyotr Ivashutin, head of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, was awakened by an urgent phone call from the duty officer. The message was brief but alarming. Chinese forces had crossed the border into Vietnam in massive numbers. Initial reports suggested at least 200,000 troops, possibly more, attacking along multiple axes. Artillery bombardments had begun hours earlier. The invasion had started. Ivashutin dressed quickly and was driven through the dark Moscow streets to GRU headquarters on Khoroshevskoye Highway. By the time he arrived, the Situation Room was already filled with officers poring over maps, radio intercepts, and satellite intelligence. The scale of the Chinese operation was staggering. This wasn't a border skirmish or a punitive raid. This was a full-scale invasion. "Get me Ogarkov," Ivashutin ordered, referring to Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff. "And wake up the defense minister. The Politburo needs to know about this immediately." As staff officers scrambled to execute his orders, Ivashutin studied the map of Vietnam's northern border. Red arrows showed Chinese forces pushing into Vietnamese territory at multiple points. The main thrusts appeared to be aimed at the provincial capitals of Lao Cai, Chao Bang, and Lang Son. If the Chinese took those cities, they would control the main highways into Vietnam's interior. Within hours, they could threaten Hanoi itself. But Ivashutin's mind was racing beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Soviet Union had a treaty of friendship and cooperation with Vietnam, signed just months earlier in November 1978. That treaty included provisions for mutual defense. If Vietnam requested Soviet military assistance, Moscow would be obligated to provide it, and that would mean direct confrontation with China, potentially even war between two nuclear-armed communist powers. "What's the status of our advisors?" Ivashutin asked. The Soviet Union maintained several thousand military advisors in Vietnam, helping train Vietnamese forces and operating sophisticated equipment. If any of them were killed or captured by Chinese forces, it would create an immediate crisis. "We're trying to establish contact now, Comrade General," a junior officer replied. "Communications are difficult. The Chinese appear to be jamming radio frequencies, but preliminary reports suggest our advisors have been pulled back from the border areas. The Vietnamese knew this was coming." That was interesting. The invasion might have been without warning to the outside world, but clearly Vietnamese intelligence had detected Chinese preparations. The question was, why hadn't Vietnam shared that intelligence more widely with Moscow? Had they been hoping to handle the situation themselves, or had they feared that warning the Soviets would trigger a wider war? By 6 a.m., Marshal Ogarkov had arrived at the GRU headquarters. At 61 years old, Ogarkov was one of the most respected military minds in the Soviet Union, a veteran who had fought in World War II and risen through the ranks to become the top military officer in the country. He listened to Ivashutin's briefing in silence, his face impassive, revealing nothing of his thoughts. When the briefing ended, Ogarkov spoke quietly. "Comrades, we are witnessing a historic betrayal. China, which calls itself a socialist country, which claims to represent the communist revolution, has launched an unprovoked attack on Vietnam, our ally, our comrade in arms, a nation that defeated both French colonialism and American imperialism. This is not just a military operation. This is a political statement. Beijing is telling the world that it no longer considers itself part of the socialist camp, that it has aligned itself with the West against the Soviet Union." The officers in the room exchanged glances. Everyone understood the implications. The Sino-Soviet split, which had been developing since the 1960s, had now become an open confrontation. China was attacking Vietnam specifically because Vietnam was allied with Moscow. This was as much about the Soviet Union as it was about Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia or the treatment of ethnic Chinese in Vietnam. the official pretexts Beijing was using to justify the war. "What are our options?" Ivashutin asked. It was the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to articulate. What could the Soviet Union actually do? Olgakov walked to the map and studied it carefully. "Limited," he said finally, "and none of them good. We could send air support, deploy fighters and bombers from our bases to help defend Vietnamese airspace. We could increase our naval presence in the region, move more ships into Cam Ranh Bay as a show of force. We could accelerate weapons deliveries, give the Vietnamese everything they need to fight back. But direct ground intervention, putting Soviet troops into combat against Chinese forces? That would be..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Catastrophic." The problem was geography. The Soviet Union shared a 4,000-kilometer border with China, most of it difficult terrain with limited transportation infrastructure. Moving substantial ground forces to Vietnam would require either crossing Chinese territory, impossible, or a massive airlift operation that would take weeks and be vulnerable to interdiction. The Soviet Pacific Fleet could transport troops by sea, but that would also take considerable time. By the time Soviet ground forces arrived in Vietnam, the war would likely be over, one way or another. More fundamentally, direct Soviet military intervention could escalate the conflict into a full-scale war with China. And while Soviet conventional forces were probably superior to Chinese forces in quality and technology, the Chinese had overwhelming numerical superiority and the advantage of fighting close to their own territory. A Sino-Soviet war could involve millions of troops, could last for years, could devastate both countries. And there was always the risk, however small, that such a conflict could escalate to nuclear weapons. At 8 a.m., an emergency meeting of the Soviet Defense Council convened in the Kremlin. In attendance were General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov, and the key military commanders, including Marshal Ogarkov. Brezhnev, at 72 years old and in declining health, looked exhausted and confused. His grasp of complex military and political situations had deteriorated significantly, and his advisors increasingly made decisions on his behalf. Ustinov, the defense minister, opened the meeting with a stark assessment. "Comrades, China has committed an act of aggression against our Vietnamese allies. This is a direct challenge to Soviet interests in Asia. The question before us is how to respond." Gromyko, the veteran foreign minister who had served since 1957, spoke next. "From a diplomatic perspective, this puts us in a difficult position. We have a treaty with Vietnam. We've publicly committed to supporting them against aggression. If we fail to act, our credibility will be shattered. Every country that relies on Soviet protection will question whether we'll actually come to their defense when needed." "But what can we actually do?" Andropov interjected. The KGB chief was known for his analytical mind and hard-headed realism. "We can't send ground troops. The logistics are impossible, and the risks are enormous. We can provide weapons and advisors, which we're already doing. We can make threatening statements. But let's be honest, China has called our bluff. They've calculated that we won't risk a major war over Vietnam, and they're probably right." Marshal Ogarkov nodded slowly. "Comrade Andropov is correct. The Chinese have chosen their moment carefully. They know we're stretched thin in Europe, facing NATO. They know our military is focused on the Western Front, not Asia. They know our logistics in the Far East are inadequate for a major operation. And they know that Vietnam, despite being our ally, is not important enough to Soviet security to justify a massive military commitment." "So we do nothing?" Brezhnev asked, his voice weak and uncertain. "We abandon our Vietnamese comrades?" "Not nothing," Ustinov said, "but we must be realistic about what's possible. I propose we take the following actions. First, immediately accelerate military aid to Vietnam. Send them the weapons they need, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft systems, ammunition, fuel. Second, increase our naval presence in the region. Deploy additional ships to Vietnamese waters as a deterrent against Chinese escalation. Third, put our forces along the Sino-Soviet border on high alert. Let Beijing know that if they consider expanding this war, they'll face consequences on their northern border. Fourth, launch a major diplomatic offensive. Condemn Chinese aggression in the United Nations. Mobilize international opinion. Paint China as the aggressor. And if the Vietnamese ask for direct military intervention, Gromyko asked, if they invoke the mutual defense provisions of our treaty? There was a long silence. Finally, Ogorkov spoke. Then we tell them the truth. We tell them that direct Soviet military intervention is not possible at this time. We'll provide every form of support short of committing our own combat forces, and we'll make it clear to the Chinese that there are limits to what we'll tolerate. If they threaten Hanoi, if they attempt to overthrow the Vietnamese government, if they kill Soviet advisors, then the equation changes. But a border war, even a large one, we can't stop it. The decision was made. The Soviet Union would support Vietnam with weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic backing, but would not send combat troops. It was a pragmatic choice, but also a humiliating admission of the limits of Soviet power. The superpower that claimed to lead the global socialist movement couldn't protect one of its most important allies from attack by another communist country. Within hours of the meeting, orders went out to Soviet forces across Asia. The Pacific Fleet was ordered to increase its presence in Vietnamese waters. Transport aircraft began loading weapons and supplies for emergency delivery to Hanoi. Soviet military advisors in Vietnam were instructed to assist with defensive operations, but to avoid direct combat with Chinese forces. And along the Sino-Soviet border, from Kazakhstan to the Pacific, Soviet divisions were placed on heightened alert. Marshal Viktor Kulikov, commander of Soviet forces in the Far East, received his orders at his headquarters in Khabarovsk. He read them carefully, then summoned his staff. "Comrades," he said, "we are to demonstrate to the Chinese that any thoughts they have of expanding this war will be met with force. I want every division along the border brought to combat readiness. I want air patrols increased. I want our radar systems tracking every Chinese military movement within 100 kilometers of our border. We will not attack, but we will be ready." One of his subordinates asked the obvious question, "Comrade Marshal, what if the Chinese do attack us? What if they use the war with Vietnam as a pretext to strike our positions?" Kulikov's answer was blunt. "Then we fight, but I don't think they will. The Chinese may be willing to risk war with Vietnam, but war with the Soviet Union is another matter entirely. They know we have nuclear weapons. They know we can strike Beijing. They may be stupid enough to attack Vietnam, but they're not stupid enough to attack us." This is all about sending a message, about showing that China is no longer part of the Soviet-led socialist camp. They're making a point. Our job is to make sure they don't get carried away and make a mistake that could trigger a larger war. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Soviet military advisors were dealing with the immediate reality of the Chinese invasion. Colonel General Konstantin Kochetov, the senior Soviet military advisor in Vietnam, had established his command post in a bunker outside Hanoi. He was in constant communication with Vietnamese commanders, trying to assess the situation and provide tactical advice. The Vietnamese were fighting hard. Despite being surprised by the scale of the Chinese attack, they were mounting effective resistance. The problem was numbers. China had committed somewhere between 200,000 and 600,000 troops to the invasion, far more than Vietnam had positioned along the northern border. Most Vietnamese combat forces were still in Cambodia, having invaded that country just weeks earlier to overthrow the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime. The troops defending northern Vietnam were mostly local militia and second-line units. Kochetov reported back to Moscow. "The situation is serious, but not catastrophic. The Chinese are advancing, but slowly. Vietnamese forces are making them pay for every kilometer. The problem is sustainability. Vietnam cannot fight a two-front war indefinitely. They need to either reinforce the north by withdrawing from Cambodia, or they need the Chinese advance to stall. Based on current casualty rates, I estimate the Chinese can sustain offensive operations for 3 to 4 weeks before they must either escalate significantly or withdraw. That assessment proved remarkably accurate. The Chinese invasion reached its deepest point of penetration after about 2 weeks, with Chinese forces occupying several provincial capitals. But they failed to break through to the major cities or threaten Hanoi. Vietnamese resistance, combined with difficult terrain and stretched supply lines, prevented the Chinese from achieving a decisive victory. Soviet support was crucial, though it remained mostly indirect. Weapons and ammunition flowed in from Soviet stockpiles. Soviet advisors helped coordinate Vietnamese defenses. Soviet intelligence provided information about Chinese troop movements and plans. Soviet diplomatic pressure helped rally international opinion against the invasion. But Soviet troops never fought Chinese forces directly. On March 5, 1979, China announced that it had achieved its objectives and would begin withdrawing its forces. The withdrawal was completed by March 16th. The war had lasted exactly 4 weeks. Both sides claimed victory. China said it had punished Vietnam for its aggression against Cambodia and its mistreatment of ethnic Chinese. Vietnam said it had defeated the Chinese invasion and defended its sovereignty. The truth was somewhere in between. China had demonstrated its willingness to use military force and had shown that Soviet guarantees had limits. Vietnam had proven its military capabilities, but had been forced to accept significant casualties and destruction in its northern provinces. In Moscow, Soviet commanders assessed the lessons of the conflict with grim realism. Marshal Ogurkov summarized it in a classified report to the Politburo. The Chinese invasion of Vietnam has revealed significant weaknesses in our ability to project power in Asia. Despite our treaty with Vietnam, despite our claims to support socialist allies, we were unable to prevent Chinese aggression or to decisively influence the outcome of the conflict. This represents a major setback for Soviet credibility in the region. But Ogurkov also noted some positives. However, our restraint prevented a wider war. Direct Soviet military intervention would have been catastrophic. We provided sufficient support to help Vietnam defend itself while avoiding the trap of direct confrontation with China. This was the right choice under difficult circumstances. KGB chairman Andropov was more cynical in his assessment. In a private conversation with Defense Minister Ustinov, he reportedly said, "This whole affair has exposed the bankruptcy of socialist internationalism. 2 communist countries went to war with each other while we stood by and watched. What does that say about our ideology? What does that say about the unity of the socialist camp? The Chinese invaded Vietnam because Vietnam invaded Cambodia. Everyone is fighting everyone else, all claiming to represent the true communist cause. It's absurd." The most revealing statements came from Soviet commanders who had served in Vietnam and witnessed the invasion firsthand. General Mikhail Varenikov, who was in Hanoi during the Chinese attack, later recalled, "When the news came that Chinese forces were crossing the border, I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. Anger that one socialist country would attack another. Helplessness because I knew Moscow couldn't or wouldn't intervene directly. I remember Vietnamese officers asking me, 'Where are your troops? Where is Soviet support?' And I had to tell them that we were providing weapons and intelligence, but not soldiers. You could see the disappointment in their eyes. They had believed in socialist solidarity, in mutual defense, and here was the reality. They were on their own." Another Soviet advisor, Colonel Yevgeny Kruglov, remembered the chaos of the first days. The Chinese came in huge numbers. The Vietnamese fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned in the northern provinces. We Soviet advisors helped where we could, coordinating artillery, analyzing intelligence, advising on tactics. But we couldn't fight for them. Moscow's orders were clear: no direct combat with Chinese forces, so we watched as the battle unfolded, helped from the sidelines, and hoped the Vietnamese could hold out long enough for the Chinese to lose their momentum. It was frustrating, because we knew we had the capability to help more decisively. But the political cost would have been too high. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 marked a turning point in the Cold War in Asia. It demonstrated that the communist world was deeply fractured, with China and the Soviet Union now effectively enemies despite their shared ideology. It showed the limits of Soviet power and the constraints on Moscow's ability to protect its allies. And it set the stage for the strategic realignment that would define the 1980s, with China gradually moving closer to the United States as a counterweight to Soviet influence. When Soviet commanders received the news that China had invaded Vietnam without warning, their initial reaction was shock and anger. But that quickly gave way to cold calculation about what could realistically be done. The statements that emerged from Moscow in those first hours and days were carefully calibrated to show support for Vietnam while avoiding commitments that couldn't be fulfilled. Marshal Ogarkov's statement to his staff, "We are witnessing a historic betrayal," captured the sense that something fundamental had broken in the communist world. Defense Minister Ustinov's instructions to provide maximum support, short of direct military intervention, defined the limits of Soviet action. And General Kochetov's reports from Hanoi, describing Vietnamese bravery and Chinese aggression while acknowledging that Moscow couldn't change the outcome, revealed the painful gap between Soviet rhetoric and Soviet capability. The legacy of those statements and decisions would haunt Soviet foreign policy for the next decade. Allies around the world questioned whether Soviet security guarantees meant anything. If Moscow wouldn't defend Vietnam, a major ally that had just signed a friendship treaty, who would it defend? The answer increasingly seemed to be only those countries essential to Soviet security, meaning primarily Eastern Europe and perhaps Afghanistan. Everyone else was expendable. Years later, after the Cold War had ended and archives were opened, historians could read the classified discussions among Soviet leaders during the crisis. What emerged was a picture of pragmatic, even cynical decision-making that prioritized Soviet interests over ideological solidarity. When Brezhnev asked, "What should we tell the Vietnamese?" Ustinov's reported response was revealing: "Tell them that we support them completely, that we condemn Chinese aggression, that we will provide all necessary assistance. Then send them weapons and hope they can manage on their own, because that's all we can really do." That gap between public rhetoric and private reality, between claimed capability and actual power, between ideological solidarity and strategic calculation, defined the Soviet response to China's invasion of Vietnam. Soviet commanders said many things in public: statements of support, condemnations of aggression, promises of assistance. But in private, they said something else. "We can't stop this. We can only hope it doesn't get worse, and we need to make sure it doesn't spread to become our war." That was the uncomfortable truth that Soviet military leaders confronted when China invaded Vietnam without warning in February 1979, and it was a truth that revealed the declining power and influence of the Soviet Union in Asia, even as it maintained the appearance of superpower status.